Second year of this SCRP-funded project, Building Supervisory Capacity, has had a train-the-trainer focus. That focus has been concerned with what to train and, of course, how to do that. But at least as important has been its focus on how to change institutional culture and practices to ensure that supervision competence becomes an enduring organizational commitment. But organizational change of any kind is difficult, and that's true, of course, in this case. To build on the discussions we've already been having about how to accomplish this, Carol Falender interviews Scott Migdole in this video. Scott is a core faculty member in the Yale Program on Supervision, a group that has very extensive supervision training experience in public mental health settings around the country.
It's with great pleasure I'd like to introduce Scott Migdole, who's agreed to talk with us today about his vast experience in supervision, integrating supervision into community settings, ensuring its sustainability, which is our special interest right now. And he's had projects in multiple venues that have been highly successful. And so we want to learn from you. To begin with, why don't you tell us a little bit about the comparability of the programs that you've done? You know, we've had a 2-year project with the Southern counties, and I know you've done definitely one in Northern Cal and a number of others.
So I'm based here at Yale, and we run a program called the Yale Program on Supervision. And we started that program now probably over 10 years ago. And its focus has been on initially providing supervisors in the public sector with practical strategies around how to effectively supervise. Mm-hmm. When we think about how to work with public sector agencies, we typically think of it in a couple of different components. The first is I typically work with executive leadership around helping them to establish sustainability strategies, training to direct care supervisors. And when we provide training, just as an aside, we provide training to levels, but not with your individual levels within the agency, but we wouldn't have your supervisor in that training because the problem is your ability to kind of be forthcoming about your experience would be far more limited. And in some agencies, we then also work with the direct care staff to understand kind of the changes, if you will, that are going to be effectuated within the agency. And so we have used this model and disseminated it in many states across the country. And over the past few years, we've actually expanded our work outside of what I would consider behavioral health to child welfare, Department of Correction. We have done a lot of work with the Texas juvenile justice system. And one of the things I've learned over time is that while the content of what people may talk about with their supervisor may be different across different sectors, the challenges people face are almost universal. And so as we talk about supervision, as we teach supervision, kind of regardless of what you're doing and where you are, the challenges that you face are likely universal to everyone in the room.
Mm-hmm. Maybe just cutting to the chase. What do you do in terms of sustainability? What are some tips?
So we believe that, ideally in a perfect world, that prior to the training, supervisors will have an infrastructure to fall back upon. Now, whether or not it happens, before, middle, or after, the infrastructure is particularly important. And what I mean by infrastructure is that the leadership of the agency is not only utilizing the model, but establishing mechanisms so that it can sustain over time. And one of the ways that we do that is we do it through the establishment of supervision standards. Mm-hmm. So for a lot of agencies, if you ask them, does supervision take place? They say yes. If you ask them how often, how long, how do you know, that becomes more challenging. And anecdotally, I bet somewhere around 50% of supervision in the public sector certainly gets canceled on a regular basis for all sorts of reasons that people are aware of, some perhaps more legitimate than others. Right. But from a supervision standard perspective, there's a couple of things that we want to do. One is we want expectations around how often supervision is supposed to take place, how long it's supposed to last for, which is particularly important because sometimes you may say, well, we met for supervision, but what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Linked to that, we want to be clear about, is it individual or group supervision, and the frequency of being able to use both. So that's one piece of what I would work, or what agencies want to work with their staff around, is that component. The second component is that when you have supervision, there should ideally be a written agenda. And if that written agenda can then drive the supervision, and the written agenda itself can then also turn into supervision notes. So the beauty of it is that you have the agenda. From the agenda drives the conversation and supervision, but then the supervisor takes notes on that agenda and ideally sends a copy to the supervisee as well, so it's not kind of shrouded in mystery. But that's one, mechanism to concretely know that it took place.
Right.
The other thing we do that's particularly important within an agency is, when you think about supervision, there's typically 3 phases. People can call it contracting or engagement. There's a work phasing, and then there's ending and transitions. For the initial phase of supervision, getting clear on shared roles and responsibilities, I think, is particularly important. We call that the informed consent process. And so part of the sustainability process is ensuring that every supervisor and supervisee within that dyad has an informed consent process executed. So from a sustainability perspective, I'd say there's 3 core components. 1, the establishment of an informed consent. 2, supervision standards. And 3, a written agenda.
Great. That's really helpful. I think in our framework, we've used supervision contracts for the informed consent. And yes, they've learned about. So that's really helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
Another sustainability strategy that can be particularly helpful, I think, as it relates to the work that's been done, is my guess would be some of the people in your cohorts know each other. They've got to know each other. And so learning communities can be particularly helpful. And the beauty of a learning community is they don't cost anyone any money. In fact, I should highlight, by the way, nothing of what I've spoken about so far is at any cost to an agency. And so when you think about learning communities, what it really means is a group, say, of 6 to 8 like-minded people getting together to talk about their successes and challenges in relation to, in this case, implementing the model of supervision that you're teaching. The beauty of it is, it's a safe place. Everyone has gone through basically the same training. You can use Zoom, so people can continue to see each other and stay connected. And I'll just say anecdotally, so whenever we train, I do train people in the learning community piece. And I will say that agencies that make a commitment to it do a better job of sustainability than those that don't.
Wow.
And one of the other pieces I would add to it is, as you're implementing the model that has been taught, every supervisor is going to experience, every trainer is going to experience their own kind of idiosyncratic challenge. But what they'll realize is it's probably generalizable to the whole group. So they come in on a Monday and they say, here's my challenge. And other people say, I have a similar process or a similar problem. And, the group just comes up with its own bright ideas and best practices. And I have found that it's really a great strategy. So I would add that into the whole thing. As you think about sustainability within the agencies itself, people probably also, so I guess as you're thinking about it and they're thinking about the staff they're working with, when you implement something new, at times people's kind of comfort level in supervision may decrease, right? Because perhaps you're talking about things that you should have talked about before. And so sometimes, people will go to agencies, will try and do satisfaction surveys, post trainings, right? Thinking that suddenly everyone's going to be happier. And I would caution agencies on doing that. Number one, because there's certain staff that perhaps we should have had more purposeful conversations with than we did. And B, I'm not sure supervision can just be captured in terms of whether or not you're happy or not happy with your supervisor. Right. What I do think, though, another sustainability strategy, though, is for supervisors in the agency itself, ultimately, to be able to have more purposeful conversations with their staff about how supervision's going, what's working, where the challenges are. And within each agency, I was talking about learning communities as it relates to the trainers that you trained. But within each agency, they can have their own learning communities as well for the supervisors that have been trained. And that because each agency is different in terms of how people implement stuff. So I would say that's particularly important as well. You know,
I think that's something that actually has flowed kind of naturally from this, because the second year they each have a project, and many of
uh,
them are choosing to do a supervision of supervision group or a consultation group for supervisors, or some way of embedding some of the practices into an ongoing system. Others are working on projects related to some task specific thing like direct observation or outcome monitoring, but many of them are more meta level.
that's great.
Mhm.
Um, as you're thinking about, or as we're talking about sustainability strategies, another thing I would add in is, there's different pieces to supervision. Obviously, there's the support function, there's professional development function. But one of the things I think that's particularly important is making sure that supervision in part is focused on helping your staff to do kind of what it is that they need to do in a day-to-day way, the tangible kind of concrete focus that you need.
Mhm.
So making sure that supervisors are looking at data within the agency and
Mhm.
taking that data and feeding it back into supervision is an enormously important sustainability strategy, because ultimately agencies will look at what supervisors are doing and say, if we have this problem, kind of what are you doing in supervision, and why do we have this gap here?
Mhm.
So being particularly cognizant of being able to take data, feed it into supervision, being able to work with it at minimum from a professional development perspective is particularly important, because it's likely that leadership in the agency will ask that question eventually.
Could you give us a few examples of data?
Yeah, an example would be documentation as an example, right? A lot of, documentation is important to virtually every agency, right? As it relates to treatment plan, as it relates to compliance, as it relates to being able to document the type of psychotherapy that you provided today or the type of intervention
Mhm.
you provided with staff.
Well, so helpful. Thank you. Those are really the main questions that I had for you. Is there anything else that you think you want to add to help us to be sure that this project, which we put so much energy and time into,
Yes,
continues?
from everything I've heard, it's a great project.
Thank you.
It really is. And I would add for people that, when they go back to the agency as train the trainer, my guess would be one of the dynamics they're going to have to face is what we call feeling caught in the middle. You get pressure from above, you get pressure from below, and maintaining that middle ground is so important, because it may be they come back and the agency leadership says, we have all of these problems, go fix them today because now you've been trained as a supervisor, right? And then they expect that suddenly through the training, all those supervisors are going to fix the problems too.
Mhm.
And, establishing a level of accountability for the supervisors you train is obviously particularly important, but
Mhm.
obviously establishing realistic expectations for agency leadership is particularly important as well. And, balancing that middle ground is one of the greatest challenges I think people have.
Yeah.
But I would
Yeah.
say, like, being aware of that challenge is particularly important. And back to what we were talking about before, I think the learning communities would be a place to talk about that.
No, that sounds really important. I guess my last question is, have you developed any strategies for dealing with the higher ups, the people even 2 or 3 levels above the supervisors or the administrators, the people really closer to the top who control the financial strings? Any kind of ideas about that?
Well, the first thing I would say is there should be some overview of the model that they're given. So, when we work with agency leadership, everyone sits through at least a kind of 2 to 3 hour overview, so people understand what it is we're trying to do.
Right.
And then I think within the context of that, it being able to explain to each person in the room at some level how it relates to each person, right? So one of the big challenges agencies typically have is turnover, right?
Yes.
The turnover relates to everything from money to human resources. So that's one example of a topic that usually kind of galvanizes people. And to be able to talk to them about one of the ideal outcomes, if you will, of this at some level is the more effective the supervision, the more supportive, and at some level, the more structure we provide to staff, the less likely it is that we'll have perhaps some of the turnover that we have. The agency turnover is a particularly important thing. And I think for agencies to run well, one of the things that needs to happen is there does have to be structure. Sometimes there's a misnomer that when all these people go to supervision training, it's just really fluffy and it's all about support and we don't have any accountability. And that's not true. And I think back to this leadership issue, you need to be able to dispel certain myths, right? And we dispel the idea that people are just here, so we can kind of pat them on the back. That may be a function of what we do, but there's other stuff we do too. So I think that's really important, is to talk to people and learn about how it actually matters. And that, when we bring people into the agency, likely younger people who are newer in their careers, that support and that training we give them, that at some level seems like they perhaps aren't producing in the way we want them to on the front end, will pay dividends over time because they'll stay with us over time. And so I would call that like a focus on career pathways, right? So we have turnover, we have career pathways. I think leadership teams are particularly kind of interested and invested in those areas. And the third thing I would say, as you think about what to talk to agency leadership about, is the issue of, billing and compliance and that stuff. And that if we are able to bring people in through our agency and they stay within our agency, they will know how to do things. And we don't have to have as much concern about bringing someone in from the outside that doesn't know what they're actually doing. Right. And so there are big kind of ticket items, I think, that are particularly important for a leadership team.
Awesome. Well, you have been incredible as always.
You're too kind.
Is there anything you want to add? You've been so comprehensive and so helpful.
I would say, to me, coming back to this issue or idea of learning communities would be really helpful to people, because I think there's just a lot of challenges that you're going to face that you don't necessarily see right now, but they're hiding in the weeds. And support from each other, I think, is really the gold standard.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
And thank you for your incredible work. We're most appreciative for everything you do.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.